tempo.
In musical terminology, tempo is the speed or pace of a given piece.
Measuring tempo.
The tempo of a piece will typically be written at the start of a piece of music, and in modern Western music is usually indicated in beats per minute, BPM. This means that a particular note value, for example, a quarter note or crotchet, is specified as the beat, and that the amount of time between successive beats is a specified fraction of a minute. The greater the number of beats per minute, the smaller the amount of time between successive beats, and thus faster a piece must be played. For example, a tempo of 60 beats per minute signifies 1 beat per second, while a tempo of 120 beats per minute is twice as rapid, signifying 1 beat every 0.5 seconds. Mathematical tempo markings of this kind became increasingly popular during the first half of the 19th century, after the metronome had been invented by Johann Nepomuk Mölzel, although early metronomes were somewhat inconsistent. Beethoven was one of the first composers to use the metronome. In 1817 he published metronomic indications for the 8 symphonies he had composed up to that time. With the advent of modern electronics, BPM became an extremely precise measure. Music sequencers use the BPM system to denote tempo. As an alternative to metronome markings, some 20th-century composers, such as Béla Bartók and John Cage, would give the total execution time of a piece, from which the proper tempo can be roughly derived. Tempo is as crucial in contemporary music as it is in classical. In electronic dance music, accurate knowledge of a tune's BPM is important to DJs for the purposes of pitch matching.
Musical vocabulary for tempo.
Some musical pieces do not have a mathematical time indication. In classical music it is customary to describe the tempo of a piece by one or more words. Most of these words are Italian, because many of the most important composers of the 17th century were Italian, and this period was when tempo indications were first used extensively and codified. Before the metronome, words were the only way to describe the tempo of a composition. Yet after the metronome's invention, these words continued to be used, often additionally indicating the mood of a piece, thus blurring the traditional distinction between tempo and mood indicators. For example, presto and allegro both indicate a speedy execution, presto being faster, but allegro also connotes joy, from its original meaning in Italian. Presto, on the other hand, indicates speed as such. Additional Italian words also indicate tempo and mood. For example, the agitato and the allegro agitato of the last movement of George Gershwin's Piano Concerto in F is both a tempo indication, undoubtedly faster than a usual allegro, and a mood indication, agitated.
Understood tempo.
In some cases, quite often up to the end of the Baroque period, conventions governing musical composition were so strong that no tempo had to be indicated. For example, the first movement of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 has no tempo or mood indication whatsoever. To provide movement names, publishers of recordings resort to ad hoc measures, for instance marking the Brandenburg movement allegro, allegro, without indication, and so on. In Renaissance music most music was understood to flow at a tempo defined by the tactus, roughly the rate of the human heartbeat. Which note value corresponded to the tactus was indicated by the mensural time signature. Often a particular musical form or genre implies its own tempo, so no further explanation is placed in the score. Thus musicians expect a minuet to be performed at a fairly stately tempo, slower than a Viennese waltz. A perpetuum mobile to be quite fast, and so on. Genres can be used to imply tempos. Thus Ludwig van Beethoven wrote in tempo d'un menuetto over the first movement of his Piano Sonata Op. 54, although that movement is not a minuet. Popular music charts use terms such as bossa nova, ballad, and Latin rock in much the same way. It is important to remember when interpreting these words that not only have tempos changed over historical time, and even in different places, but sometimes even the ordering of terms has changed. Thus a modern largo is slower than an adagio, but in the Baroque period it was faster.
Beats per minute.
Beats per minute, BPM, is a unit typically used as a measure of tempo in music and heart rate. The BPM tempo of a piece of music is conventionally shown in its score as a metronome mark, as illustrated to the right. This indicates that there should be 120 crotchet beats, quarter notes, per minute. In simple time signatures it is conventional to show the tempo in terms of the note duration on the bottom. So a 4/4 would show a crotchet, or quarter note, as shown to the right, while a 2/2 would show a minim, or half note. In compound time signatures the beat consists of 3 note durations, so there are 3 quavers, 8 notes, per beat in a 6/8 times signature, so a dotted form of the next note duration up is used. The most common compound signatures, 6/8, 9/8, and 12/8, therefore use a dotted crotchet, dotted quarter note, to indicate their BPM. Exotic time and particularly slow time signatures may indicate their BPM tempo using other note durations. BPM became common terminology in disco because of its usefulness to DJs, and remain important in the same genre and other dance music. In this context the beats measured are either crotchets, quarter notes, in the time signature, sometimes ambiguously called downbeats, or drum beats, typically bass drum or another functionally similar synthesized sound, whichever is more frequent. Higher BPM values are therefore achievable by increasing the number of drum beats, without increasing the tempo of the music. House music is faster around 120 to 128 BPM. From regular house music to UK garage, trance music ranges from 125 to 150 BPM, and drum and bass generally ranges between 150 to 180 BPM. Trance is almost exclusively produced at 145 BPM, whereas speedcore and gabba music can exceed 180 to 184 BPM.
Extreme tempos.
More extreme tempos are achievable at the same underlying tempo with very fast drum patterns, often expressed as drum rolls. Such compositions often exhibit a much slower underlying tempo, but may increase the tempo by adding additional percussive beats. Extreme music subgenres such as speedcore and grindcore often strive to reach unusually fast tempos. The use of extreme tempo was very common in the fast bebop jazz from the 1940s and 1950s. A common jazz tune such as Cherokee was often performed at quarter note equal to or sometimes exceeding 368 BPM. Some of Charlie Parker's famous tunes, bebop, sure enough have been performed at 380 BPM plus. John Coltrane's Giant Steps was performed at 374 BPM.
Beat matching.
Beat matching is a tool used by DJs that involves speeding up or slowing down a record in order to match the tempo of a previous track so both can be seamlessly mixed. DJs often beat match the underlying tempos of recordings, rather than the strict BPM value suggested by the kick drum, particularly when dealing with high-tempo tracks. A 240 BPM track, for example, will match the beat of a 120 BPM track without slowing down or speeding up, because both will have an underlying tempo of 120 crotchets, quarter notes, per minute. Thus, some soul music, around 75 to 90 BPM, can be mixed well with a drum and bass beat, from 150 to 185 BPM. When speeding up or slowing down a record on a turntable, the pitch and tempo of a track are linked. Spin a disc 10% faster and both pitch and tempo will be 10% higher. Software processing to change the pitch without changing the tempo, or vice versa, is called time stretching or pitch shifting. While it works fairly well for small adjustments, plus/minus 20%, the result can be noisy and unmusical for larger changes.
Measures per minute.
Measures per minute, MPM, or bars per minute is another way to measure the speed of music, the number of measures in 1 minute. It is commonly used in ballroom dance music.
Italian tempo markings.
The definitions of the Italian tempo markings mentioned in this section can be found in the Harvard Dictionary of Music and/or the online Italian-English Dictionary, both of which are listed in sources.
Basic tempo markings.
By adding anissimo ending the word is amplified made louder, by adding an ino or etto ending the word is diminished made softer. The metronome marks are broad approximations. Note: metronome markings are a guide only and depending on the time signature and the piece itself, these figures may not be appropriate in every circumstance. Also, in longer pieces such as symphony movements, the tempo marking used by the composer for the movement does not have to be adhered to strictly throughout the movement. Individual interpreters may vary the tempo at times, at their discretion. From slowest to fastest. Larghissimo, very, very slow, 19 bpm and under, grave, slow and solemn, 20 to 40 bpm, lento, slowly, 40 to 45 bpm, largo, broadly, 45 to 50 bpm, larghetto, rather broadly, 50 to 55 bpm, adagio, slow and stately, literally, at ease, 55 to 65 bpm, adagietto, rather slow, 65 to 69 bpm, andantino, slightly slower than andante, although in some cases it can be taken to mean slightly faster than andante, 78 to 83 bpm, andante, at a walking pace, 84 to 90 bpm. This is about the heart rate at an average walking speed, thus the tempo of 84 to 90 bpm for andante. Andante moderato, between andante and moderato, thus the name andante moderato, 90 to 100 bpm. Marcia moderato, moderately, in the manner of a march, 83 to 85 bpm. Moderato, moderately, 100 to 112 bpm. Allegro moderato, moderately fast, 112 to 116. Allegretto, close to but not quite allegro, 116 to 120 bpm. Allegro, fast, quickly, and bright, 120 to 160 bpm. Molto allegro is in the allegro range. Vivace, lively and fast, 132 to 140 bpm. Vivacissimo, very fast and lively, 140 to 150 bpm. Allegrissimo, or allegro vivace, very fast, 168 to 177 bpm. Presto, extremely fast, 180 to 200 bpm. Prestissimo, even faster than presto, 200 bpm and over. Terms for tempo change. Ritardando or rallentando, gradually slowing down. Accelerando or stringendo, gradually accelerating.
Additional terms.
A poesia, the performer may use his or her own discretion with regard to tempo and rhythm. Literally at pleasure, a tempo, at the same speed from the beginning, lies stesso tempo or lo stesso tempo, at the same speed, tempo comodo, at a comfortable, normal, speed, tempo d. The speed of a. Such as tempo di valse, speed of a waltz. 60 bpm, tempo di marcia, speed of a march. 120 bpm, tempo gusto, at a consistent speed, at the right speed, in strict tempo, tempo semplice, simple, regular speed, plainly.
Common qualifiers.
Alla, in the manner or style of, as in. Alla breve, in short style, that is, duple time, with the half note, minim, rather than the quarter note, crotchet, as the beat. Cut time. 2 halves instead of 4/4. Often marked as a C with a vertical line through it, C times signature, alla marcia, in the manner of a march, for example, Beethoven, Op. 101, all Ongorese, in Hungarian style, alla, danza, tedesca, in the style of the landauer, c. 1800, and similar dances in rather quick triple meter, see Beethoven, Op. 79, Op. 130, alla turca, in the Turkish style, that is, in imitation of Turkish military music, Janissary music, which became popular in Europe in the late 18th century, for example, Mozart, K331, K384, alla zingarese, in the style of gypsy music, alla breve, in short style, that is, duple time, with the half note, minim, rather than the quarter note, crotchet, as the beat. Cut time. 2 halves instead of 4/4. Often marked as a C with a vertical line through it, C times signature, alla marcia, in the manner of a march, for example, Beethoven, Op. 101, all Ungherese, in Hungarian style, alla danza, tedesca, in the style of the landauer, c. 1800, and similar dances in rather quick triple meter, see Beethoven, Op. 79, Op. 130, alla turca, in the Turkish style, that is, in imitation of Turkish military music, janissary music, which became popular in Europe in the late 18th century, for example, Mozart, K331, K384, alla zingarese, in the style of gypsy music, assai, very much, as in allegro assai, quite fast, ben, well, as in ben marcato, well marked or accented, con, with, as in con bravura, with skill, con brio, with vigor and spirit, con dolcezza, with softness. Delicately, con fuoco, with fire, con moto, with motion, con bravura, with skill, con brio, with vigor and spirit, con dolcezza, with softness. Delicately, con fuoco, with fire, con moto, with motion, deciso, decidedly, decisively, fugato, in fugal style, usually part of a non-fugal composition. Such passages often occur in the development sections of symphonies, sonatas, and quartets, in modo, in the manner of, in the style of, in modo napolitano, in Neapolitan style, in modo di marcia funebre, in the manner of a funeral march, meno, less, as in meno mosso, less quickly, appena, almost none, as in appena forte, almost not at all loud, misterioso, mysterious, molto, much, very, as in molto allegro, very quick, or molto adagio, very slow, non troppo, not too much, for example allegro non troppo, or allegro ma non troppo, means fast, but not too much, non tanto, not so much, per, more, as in per allegro, more quickly. Used as a relative indication when the tempo changes, piuttosto, rather, as in piuttosto allegro, rather quick, poco, slightly, little, as in poco adagio, poco a poco, little by little, polacca, generic name for Polish dances, usually the polonaise, as in tempo di polacca. Note, however, that the polacca in Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 1 shows little resemblance to the polonaise, primo, principal or early, as in tempo primo, the same tempo as at the beginning, quasi, almost, nearly, as if, such as per allegro quasi presto, faster, as if presto, senza, without, as in senza interruzione, without interruption or pause, senza tempo or senza misura, without strict measure, sostenuto, sustained, prolonged, subito, suddenly. Note, in addition to the common allegretto, composers freely apply Italian diminutive and superlative suffixes to various tempo indications, andantino, larghetto, adagietto, and larghissimo.
Mood markings with a tempo connotation.
Some markings that primarily mark a mood, or character, also have a tempo connotation. Affettuoso, with feeling emotion, agitato, agitated, with implied quickness, appassionato, to play passionately, animato, animatedly, lively, brillanti, sparkling, glittering, as in allegro brillanti, rondo brillanti, or variations brillants. Became fashionable in titles for virtuoso pieces, bravura, broadly, cantabar, in singing style, lyrical and flowing, calando, dying away, slowing, diminishing, dolce, sweetly, dolcissimo, very sweetly and delicately, energico, energetic, strong, forceful, eroico, heroically, espressivo, expressively, furioso, to play in an angry or furious manner, giocoso, merrily, funny, gioioso, joyfully, grandioso, magnificently, grandly, grazioso, gracefully, incalzando, encouraging, building, lacrimoso, tearfully, sadly, lamentoso, lamenting, mournfully, leggero, to play lightly, or with light touch, leggiadro, lightly and gracefully, majestoso, majestic or stately, which generally indicates a solemn, slow march-like movement, melanconico, melancholic, marcato, marching tempo, marked with emphasis, mazziale, in a march style, usually in simple, strongly marked rhythm and regular phrases, mesto, sad, mournful, misterioso, mystical, in a shady manner, morendo, dying, nobilmente, nobly, in a noble way, patetico, with great emotion, pesanti, heavily, saltando, jumpy, fast, and short, scherzando, playfully, smorzando, dying away, decreasing to nothing in both speed and dynamic, sostenuto, sustained, with a slowing of tempo, spiccato, slow subtle, with a bouncy manner, tenerezza, tenderness, tranquillamente, adverb of tranquillo, calmly, triumphantly, vivace, lively and fast, over 140 bpm, which generally indicates a fast movement.
Terms for change in tempo.
Composers may use expressive marks to adjust the tempo. Accelerando, speeding up, abbreviation, axel, allargando, growing broader. Decreasing tempo, usually near the end of a piece, calando, going slower, and usually also softer, doppio movimento/doppio permosso, double speed, doppio lento, half speed, lentando, gradual slowing and softer, meno mosso, less movement or slower, mosso, movement, more lively, or quicker, much like permosso, but not as extreme, permosso, more movement or faster, precipitando, hurrying, going faster forward, rallentando, gradual slowing down, abbreviation, raw, ritardando, slowing down gradually. Also see rallentando and ritenuto, abbreviations, retard, ritenuto, slightly slower. Temporarily holding back. Note that the abbreviation for ritenuto can also be rit. Thus a more specific abbreviation is riten. Also sometimes ritenuto does not reflect a tempo change but a character change instead, rubato, free adjustment of tempo for expressive purposes, literally theft, so more strictly, take time from one beat to slow another, stretto, in faster tempo, often near the conclusion of a section. Note that in fugal compositions, the term stretto refers to the imitation of the subject in close succession, before the subject is completed, and as such, suitable for the close of the fugue. Used in this context, the term is not necessarily related to tempo, stringendo, pressing on faster, literally tightening. While the bass tempo indication, such as allegro, appears in large type above the staff, these adjustments typically appear below the staff or, in the case of keyboard instruments, in the middle of the grand staff. They generally designate a gradual change in tempo. For immediate tempo shifts, composers normally just provide the designation for the new tempo. Note, however, that when permosso or meno mosso appears in large type above the staff, it functions as a new tempo, and thus implies an immediate change. Several terms, for example, assai, molto, poco, subito, control how large and how gradual a change should be, see common qualifiers. After a tempo change, a composer may return to a previous tempo in two different ways. A tempo returns to the base tempo after an adjustment, for example ritardando. A tempo undoes the effect of the ritardando. Tempo primo or tempo io denotes an immediate return to the piece's original base tempo after a section in a different tempo, for example. Allegro. Lento. Moderato, tempo I indicates a return to the allegro. This indication often functions as a structural marker in pieces in binary form. These terms also indicate an immediate, not a gradual, tempo change. Although they are Italian, composers typically use them even if they have written their initial tempo marking in some other language.
Tempo markings in other languages.
Although Italian has been the prevalent language for tempo markings throughout most of classical music history, many composers have written tempo indications in their own language. The definitions of the tempo markings mentioned in this section can be found in the Harvard Dictionary of Music and/or the online foreign language dictionaries which are listed in sources.
French tempo markings.
Several composers have written markings in French, among them Baroque composers François Couperin and Jean-Philippe Rameau, as well as Claude Debussy, Olivier Messiaen, Maurice Ravel and Alexander Scriabine. Common tempo markings in French are or movement, play the, first or main, tempo, grave, slowly and solemnly, lent, slowly, moder, at a moderate tempo, moins, less, as in moins vite, less fast, rapide, fast, tis, very, as in tis vif, very lively, vif, lively, vite, fast. Erik Satie was known to write extant tempo and character markings by defining them in a poetical and literal way, as in his Notions.
German tempo markings.
Many composers have used German tempo markings. Typical German tempo markings are langsam, slowly, lebhaft, lively, mood, massig, moderately, rasch, quickly, schnell, fast, bewegt, animated, with motion. One of the first German composers to use tempo markings in his native language was Ludwig van Beethoven. The one using the most elaborate combined tempo and mood markings was probably Gustav Mahler. For example, the second movement of his Symphony No. 9 is marked im Tempo eines Gemütlichen Landlers, its Tapisch und zu derb, indicating a slowish folk dance-like movement, with some awkwardness and much vulgarity in the execution. Mahler would also sometimes combine German tempo markings with traditional Italian markings, as in the first movement of his Sixth Symphony, marked Allegro energico, ma non troppo. Heftig, übermarkig, energetically quick, but not too much. Violent, but vigorous.
English tempo markings.
English indications, for example quickly, have also been used, by Benjamin Britten and Percy Grainger, among many others. In jazz and popular music charts, terms like fast, laid back, steady rock, medium, medium up, ballad, brisk, up, slowly, and similar style indications may appear. In Tom Lehrer's anthology Too Many Songs by Tom Lehrer, fake English tempo markings are used to humorous effect. For example, the song National Brotherhood Week is to be played fraternally, We Will All Go Together should be performed eschatologically, and Masochism Tango should be played painstakingly.
Tempo markings as movement names and compositions with the tempo indicator name.
Often, composers, or music publishers, will name movements of compositions after their tempo, and/or mood, marking. For instance, the second movement of Samuel Barber's first string quartet is an adagio. Some such movements may start to lead a life of their own, and become known with the tempo mood marker name. For instance, the string orchestra version of the second movement of Barber's first string quartet became known as Adagio for strings. A similar example is the Adagietto from Mahler's Symphony No. 5. Sometimes the link between a musical composition with a tempo name and a separate movement of a composition is less clear. For instance, Albinini's Adagio is a 20th-century creative reconstruction based on an incomplete manuscript. Some composers chose to include tempo indicators in the name of a separate composition, for instance Bartók in Allegra Barbara, Barbaric Allegro, a single-movement composition.
Rushing and dragging.
When performers unintentionally speed up, they are said to rush. The similar term for unintentionally slowing down is drag. Musicians generally consider unintentional tempo drift undesirable, and these terms thus carry a negative connotation. Therefore neither rush nor drag, nor their equivalents in other languages, are often used as tempo indications in scores. Mahler is a notable exception. For example, he used schleppend, dragging, as part of a tempo indication in the first movement of his Symphony No. 1.